The woman you put here with me, is what Adam said. One of the issues I face when working with young people, with the ones that I do, is their lack of responsibility. They will not acknowledge the things that they've done or accept consequences for their choices. I've worked with many young people who struggled with this, but one of the most extreme examples occurred when I was working at Christian Haven. A young man who was on my counseling list was going on a trip, a day trip that they were going to take. And one of the things that had been happening is the kids were stealing lighters from the vans for purposes that weren't the best. And so the driver of the van noticed that the lighter was missing. And the 10 kids on the bus, 9 of them all pointed to my student and said he did it. But he denied it. I didn't take it. So they talked to him for a while. He denied it, and he continued to deny it, and he continued to deny it. Finally, they got out of the van, they searched the entire van, and then they began to search him. And still they didn't find it, but everybody said he had taken it. Finally, they had him, because it needed to be found, had him take off his shirt, had him take off his pants and check it. And there, lo and behold, it fell out of his underwear. And of course, his response was, I didn't take it. True story. We may laugh at this or be shocked by such blatant denial of responsibility. We must acknowledge that Bobby, that was his name, is not the only one to do it. Nor is this a malady that only teenagers suffer from. I know many adults who struggle with denial and refuse to accept responsibility. If you spend some time thinking about this, you might recognize a number of high-profile people who struggle with the failure to accept personal responsibility. In many cases, they do express it in more subtle ways, but nonetheless, it is a prevalent malady. And quite honestly, in some cases, the adult denial is almost as blatant as Bobby's. But I'll let you draw the conclusion of the people that you see who deny responsibility. So I would argue that we're facing a crisis of personal responsibility in our society. We have learned the fine arts of denial and excuse making. For example, like with Bobby, I didn't do it, echoes through the lives of others. Others acknowledge the behavior, but come up with elaborate rationales of why it was not their fault. I couldn't help myself. I was just under a lot of stress. Well, someone else is to blame. If they hadn't done what they did, I wouldn't have done. They made me do it. After what they did to me, how could I not? It was just a bad day. I couldn't help myself. Another growing strategy is referred to as the victim strategy. My circumstances, my current situation are to blame for whatever I do. And thus, it's not my fault. I couldn't help myself. I couldn't help myself because of how I grew up or what happened to me. Or it's just my nature to do this. And all this denial and excuse making never allow them to take responsibility. Jonathan Sachs, in his book, talks about why this victim culture is so dangerous and difficult and detrimental. Because when we say, I can't help myself, I'm the victim, we are now the object, not the subject. Somebody does something to us, we are no longer in control. We are done to, he says, and we're not the doer. And we perennially live in denial. We never accept responsibility. I sometimes describe people as building a house of cards of denial. And so once it started to be built, to pull one out, to admit one time that they've been wrong, is to pull or take the chance that it's all going to come falling down. So just one layer of denial after another, after another. Again, there are many ways we seek to excuse our behavior and avoid personal responsibility. It happens personally, and it happens on a societal level. But again, the consequences are severe. To deny responsibility is to live in victimhood or live powerless lives. On the other hand, when one takes personal responsibility, you take authority over your life. It's to live in a healthy, confident manner. I am responsible for what I do, the good things and the bad things. It's to live as God desires us to live. It's accepting responsibility that allows us to take charge of ourselves. It permits the possibility of change and growth. Assuming personal responsibility is a prerequisite for following God. This personal responsibility is foundational for all the other levels of responsibility we are to assume. In the next 4 weeks, skipping next week when I'm gone, we will explore 4 levels of responsibility that are laid out and very well described by Jonathan Sacks in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11. These 4 things are things that we need to recognize are our responsibility to take responsibility for. First is personal responsibility. We'll talk more about that today. The second is moral responsibility. We will see the lack of this exhibited in the account of Cain, who killed his brother. He doesn't deny that he did it. He just denies responsibility for it. He had not learned what Jonathan Sacks says is the difference between something I can do, and something I may do, that I'm permitted to do. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should or that we're allowed. The third responsibility is collective responsibility. We will see this in the faithful story of Noah, who did fail in one regard. He failed to see more than the responsibility for himself. He had a responsibility to the others. And finally, there's what he calls, or Sacks calls, ontological responsibility. We will see this exhibited in the builders of the Tower of Babel. In trying to build the tower, they were trying to be like gods. This ontological responsibility speaks essentially about knowing who we are. We are not God. The essence of our being, it is important to know that God is God and I am not. Sacks speaks of a 4-act drama. He says each of these acts revealed to us something about our responsibility, and we will look at it more carefully in a little bit. As we enter into the story of Adam and Eve, Sacks offers a humorous story. He says this is a Jewish joke. For a year, Rabbi Cohen has labored to teach his unruly class about the book of the book of Joshua. No one has paid much attention, so he makes the end of the year exam as easy as possible. He asks Marvin at the back of the room, "Who destroyed the walls of Jericho?" Marvin replies, "Please, it wasn't me, sir." Scandalized, he reports this to Marvin's parents. Instead of apologizing, they indignantly reply, "If Marvin says it wasn't him, it wasn't him." In despair, he goes to the president of the congregation and tells the story. The president listens, opens up the drawer, gets out the checkbook and writes it and says, "Here's $1,000. Get the walls repaired and stop complaining." Nobody wanted to look at the reality of what was going on. Everybody was brushing away the responsibility. And we know it's a joke. The world is filled with denial, excuse-making, and victimhood. We who choose to believe in God and follow Jesus need to be people who own our responsibility. We need to take responsibility for our choices and the consequences that result, again, good or bad. As a response to this, and as we will see, critical to this personal responsibility is a willingness to choose to follow God's will. We know that the struggle with personal responsibility began in the garden. It was there that God's will and purpose was not followed. You know that Adam and Eve were created in God's image. He places them in the Garden of Eden with nearly absolute freedom, with one condition: don't eat of the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. There is perfect fellowship between God and human beings. They're naked and unafraid. They're totally exposed to God, and that doesn't bother them. Donald Miller talks about nakedness being the center story, or one of the central keys to this story, because they could be free before God because they found their identity in God himself. But then temptation comes. Satan convinces Eve that they can't live without eating the fruit. It will make them like gods, he says. Eve succumbs to the temptation. She brings the fruit to Adam, and they all eat. And look at what happens. The first thing they do is they hide from God. The intimacy and the companionship is gone. They now are fearful for God to see them holy, entirely, naked. Second of all, we find that they're afraid of God. Why is that? God's character hasn't changed, but their perception of God has changed. He's now a threat because they have sinned. They have engaged in disobedience. It's warped their image of themselves and of God. And thus they knew they were naked. They now felt exposed. God could see everything, including their sin and their shame. And we know the story goes, God comes to Adam and says, "Where are you? How did you find out about the fact that you were naked?" So feeling vulnerable and exposed, the first thing Adam does is deflect the blame. He blames both the woman and God. He says, the woman you, God, put here. She and you are to blame. Pretty bold to blame God, isn't it? But this is what the lack of personal responsibility does. It leaves an individual a victim and powerless. I couldn't help myself. That woman made me do it. Or you put her here. It's your fault. Why did you give her to me? Anything but my fault. And Eve, taking her cue from Adam, does the same thing. It's that serpent. You created the serpent, God. It was that serpent that did it. Rabbi Sachs, talking about this. Sorry, pulling this up here just a second. Says, where do we can look for guidance out of this trap of the lack of personal responsibility? Sachs says that throughout the history of Jewish interpretation of the Old Testament, the place where rabbis turned for a solution was Abraham. He says, Abraham accepts personal responsibility, heeding the word of God and setting out on a journey in obedience to the divine call. Adam is exiled from Eden against his will. Abraham undergoes a kind of voluntary exile, bidding farewell to the familiar in search of the unknown, guided only by the voice of God. You know, we've talked about Abraham in the recent weeks when we talked about Hebrews 11. We spoke, I should say, about the promise that God gave Abraham. It was the promise of a land and to be a great nation, to be a blessing. And he went faithfully into the unknown territory. But in speaking of his faith, let's not forget that it was not only did he go because he was promised, but he went as an act of obedience. He responded to a command. God didn't say, hey, if you want the promise, go. He said, go. And then he talked about the blessing that would come. And he went. Adam and Eve were told not to eat, but they did. Abraham, on the other hand, responded. Rabbi Sachs says, Abraham was a person whose life is a response to the call of God. May that be said of us. God commanded, and Abraham went. He took responsibility to respond and to obey. No excuse making, no looking for a way out. In a biblical sense, this is what responsibility entails. We hear a command from God and obediently we respond. Further, if we fail to respond, we own responsibility by acknowledging and confessing this and allowing God to forgive. So as we come to the end, we live in a society where it seems everyone is ready to follow the pattern of Adam and Eve, or maybe not everybody, but a lot. They disobeyed, they hid, and they deflected responsibility. We see this with so many people, many of whom fail to obey God and do what is appropriate. They deny what they did. They point the finger at other people. They sin and refuse to acknowledge what they've done. But as I just said, Abraham is our example. A person whose life is a response to the call of God. I pray that this might be said of us also. So how do we live as people who take personal responsibility? We commit to obeying God. We confess when we fail to do so. We own the consequences of failing to do this. I remember when I was early on a Christian, I had accidentally pulled out of our driveway at my home, and not knowing it, I had bumped into a neighbor's car. A couple days later, I heard that the car had been dented, and I really didn't know that, but now I felt really bad. It looked like I was trying to cover it up, and so I wanted to cover it up more. But in my prayer time, I felt this compelling urge that I needed to take care of this. I had to go and confess, and then I had to pay for the damage. And I'm so grateful that I did that. It taught me a lesson in personal responsibility. And I've endeavored to try to live that way since then. We are invited to live with an incredible gift of personal responsibility, to be able to do what he asks us to do and to do it well. So as we go forth this morning, I was looking here real quick for one quote. He says, Sachs says, it begins with dependence, and only slowly, gradually does it become liberty. The ability to stand back from pressure and influence upon us and act in response to educated conscience, judgment, wisdom, and moral literacy. Responsibility comes as a process. It's the decisions we make. C.S. Lewis said, every decision we make forms us one way or the other. May we be people who live personally responsible, acknowledging what we've done, accepting the consequences for it, and confessing when we've done wrong. Amen.